Um, Hello, everybody. My name is Andris Piebalgs. I am professor at Florence School of Regulation, and welcome to the webinar Methane Reduction and Energy Security, the EU's transformative role. We are like in a very particular situation today when we will joining this webinar. There are like three events at the same time and all connected. The first is winter is coming. So it's still very warm even where I live, but definitely energy security, especially after last year's difficulties, is very high on agenda. We have done our homework. I personally follow this issue and I don't expect big surprises, but it does not mean that energy security agenda is passing away. The second is COP28. And there are high expectations from COP28 exactly on methane. I will just quote, for example, what Atlantic Council recently published, why COP28 is right to prioritize global methane and flaring reduction. They say, to deliver the energy transition and meet the Paris Agreement's goals, material reductions in all emissions from oil and gas, especially the 20 billion CO2 metric tons per year of Scope 3 emissions from end-use combustion are imperative. However, reductions in Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions present a near-term opportunity for constructive, quantifiable, and verifiable action. Also, European Academy Science Advisory Council call for greater ambition and more urgency on reduction of methane leakages. So there is very clear also attention for methane for COP28 and expectations that it be success at least in this area. And last but not least, it is discussion of methane regulation. That is really complex process. There have been very steep learning curve in the European Union in general, and we are coming to the goalpost. So it is really right moment to discuss. Saying said this, today's debate very much will focus on particular role of EU as a big importer of natural gas to the European Union and as also oil. So what Europe can do really to put a leverage on global methane emissions through its particular role that it plays as a big fossil fuel consumer. Saying said this, I really would like to thank European Parliament Intergroup on Climate Change, Biodiversity and Sustainable Development and Environmental Defence Fund for organizing this event. And last remark is more for housekeeping. If you have any questions to any speakers that will be today, please put it in the chat. I will try really to put the questions to the panelists or to the keynote speaker. Saying said this, we have a privilege that two members of European Parliament that has followed and impacted the methane file in Europe very strongly are with us. And I will, without further hesitation, to give the floor to Jutta Paulus. She is member of European Parliament since 2019. She is from Green Party, and she definitely is one of the persons that is very much following methane file and advanced it to the successful, hopefully to successful conclusion of methane regulation, but it will not stop there, definitely. Jutta, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andres, and welcome to this event. I'm always happy that we have at least a few people that are interested in this topic, in this issue, because the climate killer, methane, I really like to call it that way, is much overlooked in the public observation, in the public discussions, and also, unfortunately, a bit by the media. And especially what we're doing in the European Union is so important, as we are one of the largest import markets for oil and gas, which come with methane emissions. And as we are only 10% of the oil and gas production is shored within the European Union, it is of vital importance that we also extend the regulation which we will be negotiating at the probably last trilogue next week, that we will be extending it also to imports, as we have done in other cases too. I often heard the argument, but how should we enforce any regulation outside our borders? Well, if you are producing chemicals and you want to import them into the European Union, you have to hand in a dossier to the European Chemicals Agency. We have a CBAM carbon border adjustment mechanism which is enforced. We have a due diligence law. So we have already legislation which is impacting production outside our borders. And this is only possible because we are a strong economic area with 450 million citizens. And this gives us also a very important role on the global stage. The EU was the co-initiator of the Global Methane Pledge at the COP in Glasgow. So it is high time that we deliver also on a regulatory on the regulatory area, and I am in good confidence that we will find to a meaningful agreement next week. Because of course, I do want to go to the COP with a result, but my main aim is to have a good result. Because if we would show up at the COP having a regulation which mainly cements status quo, then of course everyone would say, well, what about the pledge? You wanted to reduce your emissions, but you're not doing anything. And that would be a bad sign to the world, actually. So my main aim is to have a good regulation and meaningful regulation. And the good message is that this will even increase the security of supply. Why is this? Well, first of all, I had an appointment at the International Energy Agency in order to make sure that I have solid data below this. And the IEA, namely Mr. Birol, said what they are seeing that we will have a buyer's market in the second half of the decade when it comes to fossil gas, because a lot of capacity is coming online in the coming years. And then we will have decreasing gas demand in the US because they are really ramping up renewables all over the place. And we are seeing solar plus battery winning the auction against fossil gas, even though fossil gas is so inexpensive in the United States as compared to Europe. So we will have a lot of fossil gas producers in the US that will be looking for a market. And they are even in favor of the EU putting in place this regulation, because the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency in the US, is working on a similar regulation, which will probably be published this month as we speak. So basically, if the US producers adhere to the EPA regulation, which is probably pretty close to what we are negotiating here, they will have a good European market, and they will have a better stance as compared to producers in the Middle East or in Turkmenistan or Kazakhstan or wherever fossil gas is also produced. So what we are actually doing is, first of all, we set an example, and we should not fall back behind Canada, US, Norway, Nigeria. And second, we secure the security of supply by binding exporters to our market and increasing the volumes of what can be exported in the first place. Because every molecule that is not vented, flared, or escaping through a leak can be sold on the global market. And there are several institutes which made a rather back of the envelope calculation, but who found out that between 20 and 30% of the gas we had been importing from Russia until Putin decided to invade Ukraine could be secured simply by closing leaks, by stopping venting and flaring in the Middle East, but also in North Africa. And that is an opportunity which we should not miss. It would not come at a huge cost. That's also an estimate by the IEA. So this is something where we as regulators, as lawmakers, should make it possible to, on the one hand, help in climate action, on the other hand, increase security of supply. And I know that our industry is, at least in parts, already at the forefront, and that they will not have huge difficulties fulfilling what we are actually putting on the table. A lot of our companies are already part of the OGMP, where the monitoring of reporting verification provisions are laid down. And when you are doing monitoring and reporting, you're automatically doing leak detection, right? Because you will not be able to measure emissions if you don't look for leaks. So basically, this goes already hand in hand, and I'm pretty confident that we will find a good outcome next week. And sorry, I really have to run already because I have a trilogue on another issue coming up, and I still have to get there and with barely 10 minutes time. So very, very sorry, and I really apologize for this.
Thank you, Jutta, much appreciated, and thank you for your leadership. Now I would like to invite a member of European Parliament, Maria Spiraki, make an introductory remarks. Maria has been, it's almost her second term in the European Parliament. She has been member of European, well, how to say, map of the year of 2019, and for her work on methane, definitely she deserves another title for 2023, but we don't know if it's allowed to be second time nominated as a map of the year. Maria, we are very glad for your leadership, and really we appreciate a lot your activities around methane file. The floor is yours, but if I may already add the questions that was put to Jutta. Why, in your opinion, methane is also much overlooked? That was mentioned, so that the file does not get the attention it's actually merits. So what are the reasons? If you at the end could come to this also question, because I believe you face it facing member states in particular, or also colleagues in European Parliament. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Piggoff. It is very important for me to have you in this debate, and it is also an honor based on your experience and your seniority on the energy issues, and particularly on your involvement in methane. Allow me to say a few things concerning this piece of legislation as such, and then, of course, I am ready to try to tackle the questions that have been already raised. Starting with the efforts that we are now joined in order to have a piece of legislation concerning the reduction of methane emissions in the energy sector. Since we achieve it, and I am very optimistic on it, the European Union will become the first global partner who make this piece of legislation. So we have it in our baggage to buy, and I think that we can also recall in our institutional memory that it is the EU who started discussing how can we tackle methane emissions since 1996 with the communication of the Commission, and then in October 2020 on which we have the first methane strategy coming from the Commission, and then our report on which I was the rapporteur on how to reduce methane emission based on the measures that we can adapt, starting with reliable data, on which we will support the establishment of an independent international methane emission observatory in partnership with the United Nations Environmental Programme and also Climate and Clean Air Coalition and the International Energy Agency. We did it, as far as you remember, Professor Piggles, in Glasgow, and there was a big success, according to my opinion. It was the very, very first step, according to the Global Pledge. But allow me to highlight in the Global Pledge that the EU and US and also dozens of other countries join their efforts in order to reduce methane emissions. But at the same time, there are big emitters which are not participating in this global effort, which is, according to my opinion, of paramount importance. On methane, I would like just to recall on for our audience, particularly, that there are three sectors that they are contributing the most in this emission. The first one is the energy sector, on which we have to consider how can we tackle, and we are now in the pipeline to conclude the first piece of legislation. The second is waste, and we are waiting for updating waste management legislation, which is also very important because since we have waste management legislation updated by 2024, then we have to consider how can we tackle methane emission in this sector as well. And the third is the agriculture, which is also important and on which nobody is speaking right now. And I think that it is a very, very sensitive issue in terms of political cost and in terms also of communicating the reason that we have to proceed with this. So it's not only the energy sector, but the energy sector is the easiest one. And the easiest one, and according to my opinion, it's the only sector on which we have data, we have reliable data, and we have also mature technology and low cost in order to reduce methane emission. I think that overall, and according to the negotiation that we have already concluded, we are in a very good level in order to say that we will go to Dubai having this legislation and having a piece of legislation which is applicable and implementable. And this is very, very important, according to my opinion. It's not only to have a piece of paper and a declaration, but we are now trying to tackle methane emission and we are starting from the energy sector. It is also important to have an applicable piece of legislation. And the upcoming methane regulatory, they have to reduce the reduction, to reduce the emissions of methane swiftly as cost as effectively possible. And I think that we can also manage it. It is crucial, and I would like to go back to what Jutta has already said, that the EU methane regulation must go beyond a few simple transparency measures, and it will go on imports to secure substantial reduction of methane emissions associated with our consumption. The EU will have to play a pivotal role in reducing methane emissions from imported gas, while, and I would like to highlight it, securing our energy supply and fostering reduction all along our supply chain. We have to stick on our remit. It is also important because otherwise it will be a wish, or it will be a reason of following a reaction coming from WTO. So we have to stick on our remit, and we have to stick also on WTO provisions. This is my opinion. We have to pave the way, but we have also to understand that there is a global legal framework on which we are part of, and we have to respect it. And we have also to conclude, I have also to conclude on this by saying that we will have finally at the end of the day, and maybe before we take the plane to Dubai, a well-designed and implementable policy to ensure that the EU security of supply is not at stake, and at the same time we are paving the way on reducing methane emission. Why methane is so overlooked? Why methane is not so well known like CO2? Because in the EU we are lacking of communicating our pivotal role, our global role as pioneers in tackling climate change. Methane is the only way that we can follow in order to have a quick win. And let me give you a tip. I wrote a very small story for kids with bande dessinée on it concerning methane. And I wrote it in Greek, but I have it also in English. And I asked the Greek Ministry for Education to endorse it in the everyday education program concerning the environment. And they did it. The only way we can communicate what is the role of methane, which is the emitters of methane, energy, waste, and also the agriculture, cows and big agri-animals. It is to start from the very, very beginning, from the education. And also, of course, to communicate to the people that by changing their everyday life, they can reduce methane emissions. Once again, thank you very much. I will be at your disposal for the next hour, and then, sorry, I have to leave as well. The trialogues are ongoing in the council. And once again, Professor Piglis, I hopefully think that you can also take part in our discussion in Dubai, because the event of the European Parliament will be also methane emission and reduction in the energy sector, the first step to go.
Thank you, Mrs. Piraka, and thank you for also this contribution of this bande dessinée. So I know it's different countries. My country is not very keen on bande dessinée. It could be done differently, but it's completely true. Everybody who cares should use the best skills, and I know that you have ability to write. You are a journalist, write and to do. And I believe everybody who cares about climate change could do a small educational part, and that would help immensely. So it's true. But now, before going to questions that you already have put in a chat, let's move to the main part of our discussion, because energy security, as I mentioned, is something that you can't play. So you really should be very certain when you take decisions that could be seen affecting energy security issues. So you really need to have good investigation, how it will achieve. And we have been very lucky that today we have a presentation by Dr. Ruud Egging-Bradset. He is a professor of managerial economics in Department of Industrial Economics and Technology Management, Faculty of Economics and Management, Norwegian University of Science and Technology. He actually is a person that looks about these connections because he works with energy systems, markets and infrastructure, also transition to low carbon energy sector and society. And particularly, he also wrote about a paper for uncertainty in imperfect gas markets in 2017. He looks decisions making under uncertainty, because there is always something that you could always argue, well, if things like develop like this, what are the level of risks that we face? And that is exactly his specialty. And for last 2 years, he has done modeling and policy analysis to reduce methane emissions in natural gas and oil markets. He is definitely the best expert that could we get for discussing these issues. So, Ruud, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Piebalgs. Oh, I've brought up my slide. Can you give a thumbs up if it's visible? Yeah, okay. So I will use the next 10 minutes to discuss some analyses I've done with the global gas model. I will, And my main question in these 10 minutes is, how does an EU methane performance standard affect methane emissions as well as EU supply security? A 1-minute slide on what is the global gas model. It's a model that computes global gas trade, so trade flows and infrastructure investment. It's at the country level, and it considers upstream market power for various of the large producers. Inputs are production and consumption values. These can, for example, come from IEA, past values, future projections. We have capacities for different types of infrastructure, liquefaction, regasification, and pipelines. And we have methane emissions, abatement potentials, and technologies from the Global Methane Tracker from the IEA. And then a whole range of costs, reference prices in markets, and market power assumptions. When the model is completely set up, what can be done with it is to analyze the effects of a market shock or a policy. And the effects will then be visible in methane abatement investment, production consumption levels of gas, prices, trade, and investment in infrastructure. And I want to mention my main co-author and co-developer of the model, Professor Franziska Holz at DIW Berlin. Now, as has already been stressed by the previous speakers, EU is the initiator of Global Methane Pledge together with the USA. And this is one reason why the EU should address methane emissions, not just domestically, but also from imports. Over 95% of methane emissions related to EU supply, consumption, are outside of its borders. And the EU has a moral responsibility to abate, to encourage the abatement of the embedded methane emissions. And it's a way to show that this is achievable, and not just for the EU, also other regions that import gas. And we should align with the emission standard that has both been committed to by a range of oil and gas companies and is also adhered, proposed, already put into law by the Biden administration. The scenario analyzed specifically here, the EU implements a 0.2% performance standard on embedded upstream methane emissions of natural gas. The fee on emissions over the 0.2% standard, €1,500 per ton. We take baseline upstream gas-related methane emissions from the IEA Global Methane Tracker 2023. This puts global emissions at close to 2022 megaton, and the EU embedded emissions, so both domestically and embedded in imports, 1.9 megaton. Then average intensity and 0.7%. For this analysis, I've set up a benchmark for comparison, which is a near-term outlook. We're looking into the future, so there is some uncertainty there, but based on market developments and the situation in the last 1 or 2 years, made a baseline outlook, and this baseline outlook is then the reference for comparison. In the performance standard scenario, we have 2 parts. First of all producing countries worldwide implement all net zero cost abatement options for their entire production. Next, exporters to the EU will invest in abatement options incentivized by the performance standard and the associated methane fee. So they will implement all abatement options that are cost effective given the level of the fee. And that for the supply to the EU only. Now, we'll look at what is the impact on EU emissions and security of supply. On this slide, we have 2 graphs. I'll start with the left one. The bar to the left, the baseline emissions are the 1.9 megaton that in this outlook is the reference methane emissions embedded. That all countries globally implement all net zero cost options for abatement reduces the methane emissions by 23%. Next, that the EU imposes this fee of 1,500 euros per ton, incentivizes that 46% additionally is abated of these embedded methane emissions. And as a result, only slightly more than 30% of the baseline emissions remains. To the right, we have the same data, but with a percentage perspective. In the reference situation, the average intensity, methane leakage intensity, is 0.7%. And when I run this policy scenario with the global gas model, the remaining average intensity is 0.22%. So in sum, almost 70% of embedded methane emissions is abated, and the remaining average intensity is very close to the target level. This graph shows the regional gas supply to the EU, just under 400 BCM in this reference outlook. To the left, we have the baseline, so without any policies enforced. To the right, we have the performance standard. And what you see here is probably they look very much the same. And this is true. What we see is that there's very little impact on trade flows. The impacts of the fee and the abatement on actual market prices is just a few percent at most. And because prices and costs vary very little, trade flows will not be diverged, with some very small exceptions that fall away in the big picture. What is the impact of this EU policy on global upstream methane gas emissions? To the left, we have the baseline emissions at 22 megaton. Globally, all suppliers, all producers investing in all net zero cost abatement options will reduce these emissions by 28%. Then the additional abatement globally due to the EU performance standard would be 4%, and the resulting emissions globally would then be 68%. So this analysis, the EU implementing a 0.2% performance standard and this associated methane fee of 1,500 euros per ton, leads to 68% of abatement of EU embedded upstream emissions. The remaining intensity is very close to the 0.2% level, and domestically the EU meets the target 0.2%. We see that the 1,500 euro is high enough to make the majority of methane abatement options cost effective. And as the impact on prices is very modest, we see hardly an effect on trade flows. So we do not expect that this will actually affect supply security in any significant way. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you, Ruud, for very, very clear statements from scientists. Usually you don't hear so clear statements, so it's really impressive what you have done. Now I will move to panel. Now, if the panelist has any urgent questions to Ruud, it's now the moment to ask to Ruud's presentation. If not, then I will ask panelists to do some introductory statement, and at the end or at the beginning to respond what Ruud's conclusions have been on his study. The first speaker is Axel Scheuer. He is head of energy and climate policy at the International Association of Oil and Gas Producers Europe. I could talk long about CV, but the most important that he is one of the person that definitely has been massively involved in shaping up methane regulation in the EU, representing definitely industry's view, but trying to do it very positive angle, really to do it as efficient as possible. So much appreciate, Axel, what you are doing really in this respect. But now the floor is yours for introductory remarks and response to what you heard from Ruud. Please.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity and thanks for the kind introduction, Andries. I hope you can see my slides on the screen. And I found the presentation very interesting on the fee being put on if you don't comply with the performance standard. The Commission's proposal 2 years ago did not propose a performance standard for certain reasons. And so far, I think the political discussion has not moved yet to this innovative concept of putting a fee, establishing a performance standard and then putting a fee on it. Certainly a market sort of based penalizing process fee. I will get back to the topic of the import standard in the second half of my presentation. But as you can see from the title here, and as we are in these hours finalizing the regulation, the EU methane regulation, we took a little bit of a challenging title for this presentation: develop a proportionate and implementable EU regulation first before exporting it to the world. So let's go to COP, to something which is implementable for the industry. And if I may say so, in some regards, it is not yet the case. So there is work to be done in the final hours. Before I go into technical details of this, just let me reiterate that we as IOGP Europe and the upstream oil and gas industry do support all the high-level objectives on reducing methane emissions. There's no doubt about that. And we do support from the beginning the development of in this case, EU methane regulation. Leak prevention is inherent to our industry's license to operate, just like safety. I mean, leaks can cause fires, are dangerous, so we always tried to minimize. The EU's upstream sector makes up for less than 1% of the anthropogenic methane emissions. So it's not us who can solve the methane issue alone. We need to say that. Not meaning that it's not relevant. We will do our part, but put things into perspective. The regulation will complement an already pretty mature E&P framework in Europe. The issue is not in Europe. Satellites don't detect any methane emissions from upstream operations in Europe. The regulation should be proportionate, implementable, and efficient. And there are about 6 items I want to briefly mention, taking the occasion of this webinar just bang on time and with the audience participating. Elder obligations for subsea and subsea bed components are just not implementable and hence should be excluded from the scope or should point to or reflect existing practices for the subsea environment. Studies have confirmed this by carbon limits, but even the recent Commission's non-paper is not pointing to any possibilities to do subsea and subsea bed component elder obligations in a systemic manner. Important point. Advanced detection technologies. We should be technology open. We should not limit methane detection to only few handheld devices. Advanced detection technologies Yes, they are referred to in the regulation, but they are surrounded by criteria which make the use of these advanced detection technologies impossible. These advanced technologies have higher leak detection qualities, capabilities, i.e. not as good, because they detect more remotely. You don't go centimeters close to the steel or the valve. You have it installed remotely, cameras. You may have drone flyover programs. These have less detection capabilities, but they can detect immediately, almost, and not every 6, 12 or so months. So the detection capability is better. Rather find a big leak quickly than looking for minor leaks every X month. Good performance should be incentivized, as in every system. Survey frequencies should be relaxed if operators demonstrate combination of surveys and ADTs yielding better results. I accelerate a bit. You see a cow to the left, a nice cow. We should be proportionate in what we do. The current low repair threshold of 1 gram per hour yields little or even a negative environmental benefit. It will create a lot of significant activities, finding and fixing these leaks, but every statistical exercise shows this is less than 1% of the possible fugitive leaks. 1 gram an hour is 14 times lower than what one dairy cow emits. So just to put things into perspective, let's be proportionate. Second technical slide on venting and flaring and wells. If we continue the text we have currently on safety flaring, we prohibit any pilot flames and purge gas flames. That means we need to stop our operations because we need those flares for they are minor flames, but they are needed to ensure safe operations. So again, a technical aspect, we are pointing to it for 2 years. It's not been adopted. We cannot shut in production because of this. It doesn't make sense. Flare stack removal and destruction efficiencies of 99% are based on design specs possible, but if you replace all the flare stacks because you have now the 99% as opposed to the 98% standard, you create a lot of work and effort and a lot of activity, probably a lot of new emissions just to yield the 1% difference. So use the 98%, please. Article 18.3, there are non-implementable and unnecessary quantification obligations for subsea wells. Subsea activities are just not possible. I referred to it already. Now, I breathe, and we get to the import standard, the theme of this webinar. We do welcome the Commission's proposal of the phased approach, which we always pointed to. There's time needed to develop it all. Let's recognize that there's a consistent global MRV framework needed first before meaningful performance standards can be implemented. And Professor Rood alluded to it, but didn't delve too much into the need for having consistent, verifiable, certifiable data before you put a price on something, because methane emissions cannot be calculated as easily as CO2 emissions can be, where you take the invoice for the coal or invoice for the gas you have purchased and put into the gas turbine, you know how much CO2 comes out of it. You cannot do that for methane. So we do welcome the early warning system proposed. It makes sense because it finds and points the finger on the super emitters first. Now, let's recognize market realities with regard to the importer requirements. We have global value chains with various counterparties before the consumer consumes it, and we have a lot of commingled streams. It's not one well, one producer, one buyer. It's very complex. Sophisticated regulations, sophisticated delegated acts and implementing acts are needed to regulate this all in a fair and equitable and implementable manner. Europe, and that's the uncomfortable truth, we rely on few global suppliers for a significant share of its energy needs. And we are not so sure whether Europe will be, or the global gas market will be a buyer's market soon, and Europe has a strong buying power. We rely on LNG imports for years to come, for decades to come. Let me come to conclusion on this. So what are our recommendations? The importer requirements, when being spelled out in more detail over the coming years, need to be implementable and determine data which are consistent and verifiable. Compliance tests need to take into account not only the security of supply issue, but also the EU competitiveness compared to other regions in the world. Importers should not be held liable for if they have undertaken all reasonable efforts to get the data they are required to get. And we must distinguish between existing contracts, grandfathering rules, and new contracts. Detailed regulatory terms obviously need impact assessments. In the hectic of the emergencies in the past years, that has been forgotten occasionally. So let's come back to this common practice to use impact assessments and study before we regulate. Obviously, and in full support, the IMEO work is good and needs to be leveraged. Let's not oversight that. Let's not reinvent the wheel. Finally, the methane intensity standard should apply to contracts concluded after the implementing act has been adopted. Article 27b(3) is currently putting it on contracts which have been concluded before. So you cannot regulate, you cannot conclude contracts if you don't know which minimum standard you need to adhere to. With that, I thank you again for the time we were given, and I can conclude.
Thank you, Axel. And what you said a bit allows me to come one of the issues that was originally asked to Maria, but I will save her to answering. So when methane regulation will come in force, when it will be adopted, when the agreement in trilogue will be, as you saw, there is quite a lot of issues. Yeah, we are hopeful that it will be done full fast and it will be good regulation, but nobody could tell it this. And second, how it will look, it will be more like commission or more like parliament. It's also premature to say. I think all elements will be there, but the people who are involved in the process are not advised really to pronounce on it. And Axel mentioned a lot of points that I assume are still in the discussion. But he also helped me a lot, mentioning IMEO and also this UN issues and global market issues. And we are lucky that Manfredi Caltagirone could join us. He's the head of International Methane Emission Observatory. So he leads UNEP's work on methane emissions in the energy sector. He has a lot of technological knowledge in his previous career under UNFCCC, and he also worked as a policy advisor on climate technologies at the Italian Ministry for the Environment. So he knows Europe reasonably well, and he's even based in Europe. So Manfredi, what are your considerations taking part on this global methane emissions that you monitor, that you try to encourage to abate? So what are your reflections on Ruth's presentation and more general on the subject?
Thank you, Professor Peebles, and thank you for the invitation to the European Parliament and our colleagues here. Let me first respond to the presentation or comment to the presentation Professor Eggenbradseth made. And frankly, I'm reassured by the fact that an analysis that has been done at regional level confirms the results that other global analyses have made before. I'm thinking of the analysis the International Energy Agency has done on the role that trade can have in reducing methane emissions, and also to confirm that the price signal that would be sent is not as significant, according to the model at least, to warrant any concern in terms of energy security. Actually, we see, and Professor Pilbach has confirmed this, we see as energy security as one of the main selling point for methane reduction. Following as the member of the European Parliament, Spiraki, as indicated, following the invasion of Russia of Ukraine, we have seen a repurposing of markets and a reshaping of markets, and we have seen how consuming countries have managed to increase their imports from other sources, including through acting on resources that would be otherwise wasted. So that's I think it's very reassuring and confirms the various positive sides of acting on methane. Energy security, climate change has been mentioned. We shouldn't forget the health aspect, considering that methane is a precursor to ozone, and UNEP, together with the IEA and the Climate Cleaner Coalition, have recently published a paper connecting all these dots together that I think it can be a useful reference for our discussion. I won't be commenting on the EU regulation in general. It's best not to engage in this discussion as the discussion are going among the policymakers. But I would like maybe to recall a few principles. One is that methane emissions are an extraordinary short-term opportunity for the climate. We need to take action between now and 2030. The IPCC, the IEA, the CCAC, UNEP, most scientific papers continue to confirm that we need to reduce methane emissions by 75% in the energy sector in the next 74 months. So this is the size of the opportunity is huge, but the timing of the opportunity is short, and so we need to act as quickly as possible. We need to act as effectively as possible and as efficiently as possible, and we believe that for that to happen, indeed, we need better data, we need more transparency. We also need to recognize where we started. IMEO has been created thanks to the collaboration with the European Commission and many of the partners around here. Has been launched in 2020, just before Glasgow. We have made quite some progress collectively as a community. I'm not being self-celebratory, but we have now 120 companies that have joined the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership 2.0, representing 40% of global oil and gas production globally. We have next year companies that should be reaching the gold standard reporting, and so reach the level 4 or 5 reconciliation of emissions through source and site level. And this really will give them and the larger set of stakeholders a new tool, a new understanding of where to look for the emissions, where to act on those emissions, and to us stakeholders, the transparency, the information we need to credibly trust the data that we're given. We have new satellites that are being used in a coordinated way through the Methane Alert and Response System that will be unveiling the data for at COP. We'll start unveiling the data at COP. We're having more and more science studies over these last weeks. We are having, as a matter of fact, now a measurement campaign in Oman. That is the first scientific measurement campaign in the Middle East, to our knowledge, with the data that will be public, will be made available, and will again provide insights to the operators, insights to the government, and credibility to the information that are shared globally. We are seeing, but what we need is indeed an increase of this transparency, and we're seeing there was a recent. So I certainly agree with Axel on the relative minor contribution that the upstream operations in Europe represent for global emissions. But there is also, an opportunity here. We're seeing there was a synthesis of a measurement science paper of measurement science campaign that we're performing in Romania together with a number of institutions and with funding also from European institutions that has shown how emissions are 2.5 times higher than they were reported to the appropriate bodies. And these 2.5 times more emissions is equivalent to 1 million homes that could be powered by this methane over a year. And that is a significant contribution that the industry could be providing to this global effort, to show that this can be done, to be on the leading front of this effort. And finally, COP28, I hope, is going to be really a turning point for the engagement of the industry. Again, there is good signs from part of the industry, but this needs to become a mainstream practice. The good management of methane emission needs to become a mainstream practice across the entire industry. We need 100% of the industry to commit or close to it, and we cannot just rely on the good efforts of leading companies in this effort. There is much more that I would like to say. Let me finalize only by saying that I really believe that the European Union, as the largest oil and gas market, import market in the world, has a huge opportunity. The window of opportunity is closing. This is only the first of a much broader set of steps that the industry will have to do to get to full decarbonization. Yesterday, UNEP released, together with partners, the production gap report that shows how the governments and companies are foreseeing to produce way more than what is possible under either 1.5 or 2 degrees. So let's remember that methane action is one piece of a broader set of actions that need to be taken. And let's really seize this opportunity and provide a climate good news that is so desperately needed by the community. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I move to Flavia Solazzo. She's Senior Director of EU Energy Transition, EDF Europe Environmental Defense Fund. Flavia leads the EU Energy Transition Agenda, is engaged in EU, but she has also experience with other regions. And Flavia, now the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. It is very difficult to speak after so many interesting remarks have been made. I have here in front of me 1, 2, 3, 4 pages of notes of things that I wanted to comment on, and it's going to be a bit difficult. So apologize in advance if I go from one topic to the other. So I think. So I really liked the way Axel expressed the need of policymaking, I would say, in general, and if I'm not mistaken, he said it needs to be proportionate, efficient, and implementable, and I think this is the basis. This is the basis, and the discussions around the methane regulation is about acknowledging the legitimate concerns that everyone has, but at the same time, to make it proportionate, efficient, and implementable, we need to not compromise on the main goal, which is the most urgent, which is reducing methane emissions. And Manfredi has said it. It's methane is a very short-lived gas where we can have very, very big impacts very quickly. Jutta Paulus has called it a climate killer. Someone else in the past has said it's CO2 on steroids. So there is a need. There is the momentum now, and the window of opportunity is closing. So I think what in this phase, what is needed more than ever is collaboration among all the stakeholders to help policymakers to make a decision that represents the leadership that the EU has, and that to make sure that this action is proportionate to the climate crisis that we're facing. Because the decisions that we will take in the coming days, that the EU will take in the coming days, will likely determine not only the EU's chance of being able to meet its obligations under the Global Methane Pledge, but also will have the potential of significantly reduce the methane emissions beyond its borders and shaping also the methane policy worldwide. And I find very, very interesting what what Professor Rood said about the numbers. So basically, so by implementing a performance standard, the EU could decrease methane emissions by nearly 70%, and almost a quarter of that, 23%, could be reduced at the net zero cost. The other part that I find quite interesting is that the associated fee can provide an additional 46% of reduction, bringing us from 0.7 at the moment to 0.22, around 0.22. So I think this makes me think of the fact that there is the EU has a role to play. The regulation and getting it right from the start has a role to play. Everything is perfectible, but we have the data, we have the technology. We will have the data very soon because we have the technology to actually implement it. And it is important to do this also because this creates supplier accountability. And by creating supplier accountability, we create a framework that by being globally consistent allows us to actually collaboratively as the humankind, because actually it's as also Maria Spiraki was saying, that the energy sector is the part where we can make the biggest difference to make a difference. So I do not completely, and I usually don't contradict, I don't like that, but I do not completely agree with the fact that we don't have at the moment the technology to actually do make a change, because actually we will have as Manfredi was saying, there are satellites, there are drones, infrared cameras that can already produce methane emission data that is precise and that will equip emitters to implement those solutions. EDF has done monitoring experiences. We have looked at the emissions in cities, but also in production sites, and it demonstrates that actually, yeah, we've seen the data, and it is indeed possible. With regard, I just want to make one last point about the possibility that the EU methane regulation actually gives to have a globally consistent framework. So I think if the EU, along with other significant importers like China, Japan, South Korea, I think we do account to around 70% of the global gas trade. So if the EU puts in place something like this, and I mean, if the US has put in place a 0.2 performance standard, why would the EU not be able to do this? Indeed, we can play a leading role in establishing also an MRV framework that will allow us to have data that is comparable. So, yeah, I think I will stop it here, but I think, yeah, everything at the moment going in the right direction in order to make this happen. And indeed, the role of the EU is crucial.
Yeah, thank you very much, Flavia. So I thank you also for all the questions that you got. I would just make two notes. One is I know that Maria Spiraki is very running. So whenever, Maria, you would like to take the floor, please indicate, because we understand that you are under permanent time pressure. So if you would like to intervene now, it's fine, because I could go with questions to panelists afterwards.
I appreciate very much, Professor. I would like just to say a few things concerning, first of all, the legislation which is in the pipeline. I'm not optimist. as far as I can say that we will impose strict measures to the importers, but I'm quite optimistic that we will have an implementable and applicable piece of legislation on the table by the end of next week by concluding the trilogue. And I'm optimistic because, first, we share common targets and we share a common approach in terms of reducing methane emissions from big emissions and big emitters and not going into details and losing time and money. Second, because we know that the remit that we have is to have a legislation which will be applicable within the EU and also affect the imports in the EU without disrupting the market and without posing issues in terms of implementing the regulation of WTO. When it comes to fees, there is no question or any other discussion concerning fees. I would like to be very clear on this because we're not in this level. And please let me recall that the issue of the affordability of the energy is the main issue we have to tackle also during this winter. We are not out of the problem. We are still in the pipeline of the problem and we are looking for the light of the end to the end of the tunnel, but it's not the end now. So the affordability of the energy is a huge problem, and speaking for my home country, Greece, there are a lot of government and state aid subsidies to the most vulnerable, explain the problem and taking into account the index of the energy poverty that they face. Going to the issue of the contribution of the private sector, I'm quite sure that the private sector is doing a lot in order to reduce methane emission, but the case is that if the private sector is ready to do more. And according to my opinion, the private sector is able to do more. We consider all the issues that Axel has already put on the table, particularly concerning the issues which is affecting the subwells, etc. But it is time to the private sector also to adapt and understand that they have to contribute. And all the questions that friends from the audience has already posed. The first is the energy sector is the easiest sector to tackle methane emissions because we can have MRV, which is monitor, reporting, and verification system. And by this, we can identify the big emissions and we can go on with repairing the big emissions, the sources of the big emissions. And that's why we can tackle the issue as fast as possible. And of course, we have to reduce the large-scale emissions. There is another question concerning the institutional framework on which Professor Piglis has already answered due to his former capacity as a commissioner in the European Union. We are not at the time to say that we co-sign and we shake hands, but we are in the trialogue, so we would like to find common ground between the Parliament and the Council, and the Commission in this case is acting as an honest broker. Concluding, I would like to say, yes, it is the energy sector on which we are working now, but allow me to recall that we have to work also on the waste sector and also on the agri sector. To reduce methane emission is an easy win, it is a quick win, but we have to contribute with all sectors. Thank you very much once again for having me today and for this very, very interesting exchange of views. And Professor, hopefully see you in Dubai.
Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Spirakis. Thank you for your contribution and of your leadership, as I mentioned already. Thank you very much. Now to the questions that I would like to ask. One, I will start with the easiest question from audience. It comes from Julian to Manfredi, because we need to somehow to start with the easier question. The question is why, if it's cost efficient, companies are not doing it now. It is from Julian. So he says there's a huge part of methane emissions that you could immediately, or not immediately, but you could definitely invest and recover your investment by capturing these methane emissions.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Pibas, and thank you for the question to our audience. So there are several reasons, obviously. Let me start with naming some. I mean, the first one often is that they don't know where the emissions are coming from. Natural gas is odorless. Natural gas is invisible. Natural gas is largely methane, and so methane is odorless and is invisible to the human eye. And so unless you start looking for it with ways that are becoming increasingly available, precise, and trustable, then you wouldn't know where the emissions are from. The second is a problem of practices. So once you know where the emissions are, then you need to put forward practices to make sure that those leaks are repaired quickly, are checked, become part of the operational practices of all companies, not only the leading companies such as those who are about to become oil and gas methane partnership 2.0 gold standard reporting in 2024. The third aspect is accessibility so the ability to bring this product to the market. We need to ensure that the infrastructures are available and that this gas that would otherwise be wasted be prioritized for dispatch in this infrastructure. The last thing, but there are many others, is that the fact that something is economical doesn't mean that is as profitable as doing something else. So you might have again the ability to recover some of the cost or entirely the cost, but often companies are seeking a return on investment that is much higher than the one that reducing leaks would allow for. Again, there is many other reasons, but just to highlight some of these, if you wish, market failures that make it possible, even if less and less accepted and acceptable for so much methane to be released in the atmosphere.
Thank you. Flavia, you get a more tricky question. It's from Brandon Locke. He says, in terms of making the import standard feasible and implementable, and taking into account the need for some time to develop a clear performance standard methodology, would it be reasonable to start with a simple and rapid ban on routine venting and flaring as we work to develop the intensity methodology?
Well, I think it would be, because this is kind of something that is quite easy, either you do it or you don't, and if you don't, then the gas doesn't enter the EU. The thing is, we are at the end of a legislative process, so now things are on the table or are being discussed. It would be easy in terms of making the import requirements as simple and as implementable as possible. I think we really need to also take into account that the window of opportunity is closing. So the phased approach cannot take 10 years. And we, well, 10, yeah. So I think this is crucial. I also think that as Jutta Paulus was saying, if you monitor, you detect the leaks and you can repair them. So there, I don't see this difference in doing something in Europe and not being able to do it in the supply chain. And the EU, I think, has the moral obligation to use its regulatory authority to do that, especially on what is its own footprint. Footprint.
Yeah, thank you, Flavia. Axel, you have many questions, but I think they go in the same direction. I will start with Sarah's question and then two other questions that I would like to add. One is what she says, the US oil and gas industry will be confronted with a methane standard of 0.2 from next year onwards. Why do you think the rest of industry would be slower to adapt than the US companies and keeps demanding such a long introduction period for a 0.2 industry standard? There is similar question also from Zita Litsompa saying European upstream emissions do account for 1% of total emissions, but the emission from countries exporting to EU, it's 10%. These contributions highlight the importance of the application of EU methane regulation to imports. And then one question is completely different area. It comes from Yoko Salo. It's about technical standards for measuring equipment. As I understand, they work on this issue, and there is definitely some positive response from industry. The question is, technical standards, could Europe be leader on this technical standard for as equipment you need really to measure methane emissions? So the first part is more political. The second part is well, partially political.
Interesting questions indeed. Why slow? When I started my career decades ago, someone told me what you can't measure, you cannot manage. And again, methane emissions are different to CO2 emissions. CO2 emissions you can easily calculate. The amount of gas you have, you combust it, you know the CO2 emissions. For methane, that is not the case. You need to estimate it. When you estimate it and you want to take policy action on the basis of estimations, you need to have standard methodologies and calculation procedures. And that does not exist. OGMP 2.0 is one good initiative globally. If you want to put a price on something or legal action as a consequence of meeting standards, yes or no, the numbers need to be somewhat robust. In any case, the focus should be more on the finding and fixing of the key methane emitter instances than getting lost in detail on the quantification of the most minor leaks. So there's a balance in that. The second question, I can't comment on the upstream methane intensities in other regions of the world. We have the data for the EU. I shared them with you. I think European producers are best in class with regard to methane emissions. It's good that the US is putting in place also methane regulation with stringent intensity standards. Not quite sure what the question was there. Again, figures like 1% and 10%, it depends. What are you dividing by what? Where's the data coming from? Who has estimated it? There's a lot of technologies, and that's probably answering now the third questions out there who can detect methane emissions at various levels. Satellite technology is being referred to, but let's be honest, it's picking up only the most major methane leaks in the world, none of them in Europe. If you do drone flyovers over producing fields, that is a technology you can do that in a more structured way, or you go very near with OGI and FID devices near the steel and you try to find the most minor leaks. Different technologies exist. They need to be made comparable. So working on standards, technical standards for the measuring of methane emissions in a comparable way, in a certified way, so that we're not talking apples and bananas when the one gets a price tag for a certain emission level and the other gets a price tag for another methane emission level. Final comment, I think I said it before, let's not forget Europe is dependent on energy supplies from global suppliers, and there are not that many energy suppliers globally who supply Europe with their natural gas. I stop here.
Thank you. I have time only for 3 more things. One question to Flavia, then Ruud. I have not got any direct questions to you, but I would be happy if you make any comments in this debate, how it coincides with your research or whatever you would like to conclude, and then is my conclusion. For Flavia, the question is rather tricky, but I will not ask is exactly the form it was it. Will EU methane regulation better or worse than US or Canada regulations? That is the essence of the question. I would say how much compatibility you would find in the regulation in US in particular, because it's the biggest supplier of LNG today and most probably will be growing the part of LNG from US to European market. How much similarities or is it these regulations going in the same direction, or it will be rather diverse? I would say frameworks in US and EU. What is your observation? Okay, we don't know exact formulation of EU legislation, but we could anticipate the main outline at least.
Yes, I think what I would phrase it in another way. If imports start being tackled, then we will actually be able to have something that is comparable and that can set the basis for a buyer's market, for reducing methane emissions globally, because like this you will start having comparable approaches, etc. If we don't do this, if Article 27 doesn't have a performance standard, I think this will be very, very, very difficult. And I just like to add again, since satellite have been mentioned a couple of times, and now I see there is a question, but about methane set, and Manfredi can definitely answer that as well. But I think the main point about, well, there are a lot of things that could be said, but the main point of this explosion of technology, including methane sat, is that we will actually be able to cross check and cross reference. One interesting thing about methane sat is that the data will be publicly available, so everyone will be able to actually go and check and to very, very quickly be able to emitters can be made aware that there is a leak and there is something that needs to be repaired quickly. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruud. Now, from you, concluding remark, I would very much appreciate.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the honor that I am allowed to wrap up. So I think there's been a very nice exchange of perspectives. And although I was brought on in my role as an academic researcher, and I want to make an appeal, and that is to the oil and gas industry, that to maintain the license to operate and maintain a legitimate position as energy providers, to take responsibility. And I understand a desire to delay stringent measure, but in the broader perspective, the world has a problem. And I personally believe that the $1,500 per ton, which is quite close to the US value, which is an indication for the social cost, I think it's too low in itself. It is in the range of values that's possible. It is low, and it is a global average. And I think there's people in different parts of the world where their experience cost level is a lot higher than this global average. So I think that the oil and gas company, there's enough opportunities to develop further measurement technologies and abatement technologies. Another appeal I want to make is for the EU and other and NGOs and other partners to seek partners. Well, I have done some analysis for which I have not shown results, and that shows that if you're able to include, for example, Japan, Korea, especially China, in a coalition of countries that all set a performance standard and then impose a methane fee, you get a much larger impact globally on the methane abatement, reduction of emissions. And as Flavia indicated, the window of opportunity is closing. So please make some steps in the right direction.
Well, I need to conclude, and first of all, I very much appreciate participation of all the speakers and their contribution, also your participation. I basically would say we got a good news today, because it seems that methane regulation discussions are coming to the end, and I believe that there will be always disappointment. For some, it will be too much, for some, not enough, but it is pioneering effort. It's really something that would be impossible, 3 years ago. If somebody would have talked that we will have methane regulation during this legislature, we would never believe in it. Also, the topic of today, 2 years ago, I think Florence School of Regulation actually wrote a paper on performance standard. It was not very well, no, I would say it was not noticed. So it was not neither positive, neither negative. Now we are in this issue. Where the legislators will come to it, we don't know exactly, but it is on the table. And I think that is already a success. So there is no such a controversy also in today's debate. It is if you apply, you need really to have also the schemes in place, how you apply, how you proceed in the correct way, and there will be enough for discussion? I don't know. But definitely today's debate very much helped, really, if policymakers have been watching it and looking for arguments one way or another, they definitely could see it. And let's hope that we will finish what both our MEPs said, that it will be very, very ambitious methane regulation that will make Europe proud coming to COP28, and it will be agreed before COP28, because then the message definitely is more stronger, and we have a high expectations from COP28 on methane, because it is in the countries that is oil and gas producer, and roots call for producers really to be part. You need to move methane, and I do agree with this. And it is a chance. It's chance for industry really to not completely get away from all the efforts to topple it down or to attack it, but at least it is very legitimate defense. And there is a demand. We are taking care about all the emissions that we care. So I think that is really, it's important also for industry, and Axel really very much clearly defends this. So with this, I would conclude thanking all the participants, and also all the organizers, and Regine for allowing us to communicate still virtually. Thank you, and let's hope that we will see in some next events on methane, and its attendance will be good as well. Thank you.